The game was never random. They thought you were the easy target. They thought your calm meant you would not fight back. They thought your silence meant you would absorb the damage quietly. They thought your kindness was naivete, and so they played, not carelessly, not impulsively, but deliberately. They studied you the way a gambler studies a table before placing a high-stakes bet. They watched your reactions. They tested your boundaries in small increments. They measured how far they could push before you pushed back. And each time you chose restraint over retaliation, they grew bolder. To them, this was a psychological sport. Every emotional trigger they pressed was intentional. Every withdrawal of affection was calculated. Every sudden coldness after warmth was engineered. They wanted you confused. They wanted you destabilized. They wanted you questioning your own memory, your own perception, your own worth. And for a while, it worked. Because people who live with integrity do not assume deception. People who value truth do not instinctively suspect performance. You were operating from sincerity. They were operating from strategy. But here is what they never accounted for. When someone builds their advantage on manipulation, they are not just playing against another human being. They are stacking their future against their present. That is the part they did not see. They believed they were in control of the board. They believed they could move the pieces and never answer for the moves. But every game has rules, and some rules are written into reality itself. This was never random. It was structured. It was intentional. And that is exactly why it was dangerous. The danger was never simply emotional. It was structural. What they did to you was not just a relational misstep. It was not a personality clash. It was not two flawed people failing to understand one another. It was the deliberate exploitation of trust. And when trust is weaponized, something far more serious is set in motion. You see, manipulation only works when one person is operating in good faith and the other is not. You entered that connection, assuming mutual sincerity. You believed that when someone spoke, they meant what they said. When they apologized, you assumed remorse. When they promised, you assumed intention. But they were not playing the same game you were. They were not seeking intimacy. They were seeking leverage. Every vulnerable confession you made became stored information. Every insecurity you shared became a future pressure point. Every act of forgiveness signaled how far they could push next time. This is what made it very dangerous. Because they were not just testing your emotions, they were testing how much distortion reality could withstand before it fractured. Gaslighting is not merely lying. It is the systematic erosion of someone's internal compass. It is the quiet rearranging of facts so that the victim begins to distrust their own perception. And when a person begins to distrust their own perception, they become unstable not because they are weak, but because the ground beneath them has been deliberately shaken. That is not accidental harm. That is engineered destabilization. For someone in midlife, someone who has built decades of experience, wisdom, family history, faith, and resilience, to suddenly find themselves questioning their own sanity is profoundly disorienting. They attacked your certainty. They targeted your stability. They tampered with the internal architecture that took you years to build. And here is where the spiritual dimension becomes unavoidable. There is a moral gravity in the universe. It is not mystical superstition. It is order. When someone deliberately distorts truth to control another human being, they are violating something sacred. Truth is not merely a preference. It is foundational. Christ did not describe himself as strategy or charm or dominance. He described himself as truth. So, when someone systematically twists truth to gain control, they are not simply being dishonest. They are aligning themselves against the very principle that sustains reality. That is why this was dangerous beyond what they realized. They believed they were clever. They believed they could outmaneuver you psychologically. They believed that as long as they avoided public exposure, there would be no consequences. But consequences are not always social. They are often structural. When a person repeatedly chooses manipulation over integrity, something shifts internally. Conscience dulls, empathy thins, authentic connection becomes harder to access. And over time, that internal erosion begins to manifest externally. Relationships become transactional. Trust becomes fragile. Peace becomes rare. Because you cannot repeatedly violate moral order and remain unaffected by it. This is not about lightning bolts or dramatic punishment. It is about trajectory. Every decision bends a person in a direction. And when that direction is consistently toward deception, control, and ego, it builds momentum. The narcissist thought they were gaining advantage. What they were actually doing was accumulating imbalance. They believed your silence meant they had won. What they did not understand is that restraint often signals something far more powerful than retaliation. Alignment. You chose not to manipulate back. You chose not to smear. You chose not to mirror their tactics. That choice matters, because in any moral confrontation, one person is building weight while the other is shedding it. They were building weight layers of distortion, pride, and entitlement. You were shedding weight, clarity, discernment, boundaries forming quietly inside you. That is why the game was very dangerous. Not because you would destroy them, but because reality eventually corrects imbalance. And when correction comes, it does not negotiate with ego. They gambled with someone who values truth. They gambled with someone who refuses to become cruel just because cruelty was shown to them. They gambled with someone who, even in pain, would rather surrender the outcome to God than seize control through revenge. That combination is not weakness. It is stability. And when manipulation collides with stability rooted in truth, manipulation eventually collapses under its own distortion. The narcissists believed they were playing chess. What they failed to see was that the board itself had rules they could not rewrite. And every move they made, every calculated withdrawal, every lie, every smirk at your confusion was recorded not in a public ledger, but in the structure of their own becoming. That is the part they never saw. You were not just enduring a difficult person. You were standing inside a moral collision, and they were the one accelerating toward the wall. The moment you stepped back, the shift began. There is a moment in every destructive dynamic that feels like defeat, but is, in fact, the beginning of reversal. It does not arrive with applause. It does not announce itself with confidence. It often feels like exhaustion. For you, it likely came quietly. The day you stopped explaining yourself. The day you stopped trying to prove your sincerity. The day you realized that no amount of clarity could penetrate someone committed to distortion. You stepped back, and from the outside, it may have looked like surrender. But stepping back from chaos is not surrender. It is alignment. You see, narcissistic manipulation survives on friction. It feeds on reaction. It grows stronger when you defend, argue, justify, and over-clarify. Every attempt you made to fix the misunderstanding was interpreted not as goodwill, but as confirmation that the game was working. They needed your participation. The moment you withdrew it, the entire system destabilized. That was the shift. Not because you suddenly became powerful, not because you plotted retaliation, but because you removed yourself from the distortion. There is something profoundly unsettling to a manipulator when their target goes silent, not out of fear, but out of clarity. When you no longer chase resolution, when you no longer seek validation, when you no longer attempt to repair what they keep breaking, Silence in that moment becomes exposure, and here is the deeper layer most people miss. When you stopped fighting to be understood, you stopped trying to control the outcome. You released it. For many in midlife, after decades of solving problems, protecting families, fixing crises, releasing control feels unnatural. You are used to managing outcomes. You are used to carrying responsibility. But this time, you placed the matter somewhere else. You entrusted it to God. Not dramatically, not with vengeance, but with weary honesty. Lord, you see this. That quiet surrender is not passive. It is an act of profound trust, and trust shifts the ground beneath everything. Because when you stop trying to engineer justice yourself, you step into a posture that allows moral order to operate without interference. The narcissist expected escalation. They expected anger. They expected confrontation. They expected you to defend your reputation or attack theirs. They did not expect composure. They did not expect boundaries. They did not expect you to walk away without theatrics. And that is what unsettled them most. When you stepped back, you did not collapse. You recalibrated. Your discernment sharpened. Your emotional reactivity lowered. Your prayers became clearer. You began to see patterns instead of incidents. You began to recognize cycles instead of isolated mistakes. You began to understand that what you were dealing with was not miscommunication, it was character. And once you see character clearly, you no longer negotiate with illusion. That internal clarity is the beginning of structural change. Because here is what happens when a narcissist loses access to your emotional energy. They must face themselves. They no longer have your confusion to distract them. They no longer have your reactions to validate them. They no longer have your over-explanations to twist. Instead, they encounter something far more uncomfortable: stillness. And stillness exposes what noise once concealed. This is the part few talk about. When you stepped back, you disrupted a supply line. Narcissistic personalities draw identity reinforcement from others. Your empathy, your patience, your willingness to assume the best, these were fuel. When that fuel disappeared, their internal instability intensified. They may not articulate it. They may mask it publicly. They may even pretend relief. But internally, something shifts. Control diminishes. Confidence flickers. Irritation increases. Because they can no longer move you like a piece on a board. You are no longer reacting to every move. And when someone built their sense of power around your reactions, your calm becomes threatening. That is why the shift began when you stepped back. Not because you attacked, but because you stopped participating. In Christian life, there is a pattern repeated again and again. When Christ was falsely accused, he did not scramble to defend himself against every distortion. When mocked, he did not descend into petty retaliation. There were moments he spoke truth directly, and there were moments he remained silent. Silence was not weakness, it was sovereignty. And when you chose measured silence instead of frantic defense, you stepped into that same pattern, not perfectly, not flawlessly, but intentionally. You trusted that truth does not require hysteria to survive, and in doing so, you placed the outcome beyond manipulation. The narcissist thought they were playing against you. They did not anticipate that the moment you stepped back, they would be standing alone with the weight of their own choices. That is the shift. It is subtle. It is quiet. But it is decisive, because from that point forward, every consequence they encounter is no longer buffered by your energy. There is no emotional shock absorber. There is no loyal defender. There is no empathetic translator softening their harshness for others. There is simply reality. And reality, when no longer distorted, is steady. Once you stepped back, something began to unfold that the narcissist could not control. not immediately, not dramatically, but steadily. Major endings rarely announce themselves with thunder. They arrive as fractures. At first, it looks like inconvenience. A deal that should have closed doesn't. A partnership that seemed solid strains. An opportunity that felt guaranteed dissolves at the last minute. Individually, each event can be dismissed. Bad timing, unfortunate circumstances, just life. But when patterns begin to cluster, something deeper is occurring. Because when a person builds their world on distortion, that world eventually destabilizes under its own weight. You must understand this clearly. Divine correction is not emotional, it is structural. God does not operate through chaotic vengeance. He operates through order. When order has been violated repeatedly, it begins to reassert itself. The narcissist believed they could compartmentalize their behavior, that what they did to you would remain isolated, that deception in one area would not affect the rest of their life. But integrity is not compartmentalized. A person who manipulates truth in private begins to weaken their relationship with truth everywhere. And when truth weakens, stability weakens. That is where the major endings begin. Not because lightning strikes, but because foundations crack. Their confidence, once inflated by control, becomes brittle. Their relationships, once sustained by charm, grow tense. Their sense of superiority, once fueled by your reactions, loses oxygen. There is something profoundly unsettling about losing access to influence. When they could provoke you, they felt powerful. When they could confuse you, they felt dominant. When they could distort reality and watch you question yourself, they felt in control. But now, you are not reacting. You are not defending. You are not chasing closure. And without your participation, their power shrinks. That shrinking spills into other areas. When a person becomes accustomed to control, any loss of it feels catastrophic. They may overreact in other relationships. They may attempt to reassert dominance elsewhere. They may grow impatient, agitated, unpredictable, and that agitation exposes them. Colleagues notice. Friends sense tension. Family members feel the volatility. The mask strains. And as the mask strains, credibility thins. This is one of the most devastating endings a narcissist can face, the quiet erosion of influence. They built their identity around being the one who dictates the emotional climate. Now the climate no longer responds, but the deeper ending is internal. There is a psychological phenomenon that occurs when someone can no longer externalize blame effectively. For years, they projected responsibility onto you. If you were upset, you were too sensitive. If you questioned inconsistencies, you were paranoid. If you expressed hurt, you were dramatic. Projection works until it doesn't. When you stepped back and stopped accepting that narrative, their projections had nowhere to land. And when projection fails, introspection threatens. For someone unwilling to self-examine, that threat manifests as anxiety. Restlessness increases. Sleep becomes shallow. The mind rehearses conversations that no longer exist. You see, narcissism survives on distraction. It requires constant external stimulation to avoid confronting internal emptiness. But when relationships destabilize and admiration diminishes, distraction weakens. Stillness creeps in, and stillness forces awareness. They may not consciously admit regret. They may not confess wrongdoing. Pride often blocks that. But internally, there is disorientation. Why aren't things working like they used to? Why aren't people responding the same way? Why does everything feel slightly unstable? Because control has limits. And when someone repeatedly chooses manipulation over humility, they slowly dismantle the very support systems that once sustained them. For a man or woman in midlife, accustomed to reputation, to established roles, to social standing. The erosion of stability is deeply unsettling. This is not the chaos of youth. This is structural decline. A career path that once felt secure begins to plateau. Friendships once unquestioned begin to thin. Social circles subtly recalibrate, not in dramatic betrayal, but in quiet withdrawal. And withdrawal is an ending. One of the most severe forms of consequence is not public humiliation, it is the gradual realization that influence is fading, that respect is no longer automatic, that admiration must be forced, that authority feels hollow. You must understand something important here. This is not about celebrating their collapse. It is about recognizing moral gravity. When someone plays a very dangerous game, when they intentionally destabilize another human being for ego gratification, they are not just creating emotional damage. They are altering trajectory, and trajectory always reaches destination. The narcissist believed that by undermining you, they were elevating themselves. But elevation, built on degradation, is unsustainable. Eventually, imbalance demands correction. And correction looks like endings. Endings of illusions. Endings of influence. Endings of false narratives. Endings of relationships built on performance. Perhaps most painful of all, endings of self-deception. Because when everything else begins to shake, there is a moment often late at night when denial thins. When the house is quiet, when the phone stops buzzing, when distraction fades, and in that quiet, a question surfaces. What if I was wrong? That question is terrifying to someone who built their identity around never being wrong. It is easier to double down. It is easier to blame new people. It is easier to rewrite history again. But each rewrite requires more effort. Each defense requires more energy. Each manipulation requires more precision, and exhaustion follows. That exhaustion is an ending. The ending of effortless dominance. The ending of unchallenged narrative control. The ending of believing they could play with someone's heart and walk away untouched. You did not have to orchestrate this. You did not have to expose them. You did not have to destroy them. You simply stepped out of alignment with chaos. And once you stepped out, the system began correcting itself. The mask is cracking. For years, sometimes for decades, they refine it. They learn which version of themselves earns trust, which tone commands respect, which posture signals authority. They adjust language depending on who stands before them. They present strength when needed, vulnerability when strategic, charm when useful, but image requires maintenance, and maintenance requires vigilance. The longer someone lives through performance rather than authenticity, the more energy it takes to sustain the illusion. Every exaggeration must be remembered. Every distortion must be defended. Every contradiction must be managed carefully. At first, it feels effortless, but over time, it becomes exhausting. The crack does not begin in public. It begins in the interior life. There is a growing dissonance between the self-presented and the self-known privately. That dissonance produces strain. A person may not articulate it, but they feel it, an irritation without clear cause, a restlessness that does not resolve. When identity is built on control rather than truth, it cannot rest. Truth allows rest. Performance demands tension, and tension accumulates. Subtle inconsistencies begin surfacing. Reactions become disproportionate. Defensiveness appears more quickly than before. Small questions feel like threats. Clarifications feel like accusations. Because when someone is guarding an image, even harmless inquiry can feel dangerous. For a man or woman in midlife, someone who has invested decades building reputation, the thought of exposure is deeply destabilizing. But what is being exposed is not necessarily scandal, it is incongruence. When what one claims does not consistently align with how one behaves, perception shifts. Not through confrontation, not through dramatic revelation, but through pattern recognition. Over time, others begin adjusting their expectations quietly. They confide less, they trust less, they observe more, and the narcissist senses that shift. What once felt like influence begins to feel fragile. What once felt like command begins to feel contested. What once felt natural begins to feel forced. This is the crack widening. The most painful aspect of this ending is not external. It is internal. When someone has lived through image long enough, they often lose clarity about who they are without it. If admiration fades, what anchors them? If control diminishes, what stabilizes them? If intimidation fails, what remains? Behind the mask lies a self that avoided accountability, and accountability is humbling. Humility requires acknowledging harm. It requires admitting that choices were selfish, that words were manipulative, that power was misused. For someone whose ego is structured around superiority, this admission feels intolerable, so they resist. But resistance does not repair fracture. It deepens it, because truth has weight. In Scripture, light is described not only as comfort but as exposure. Everyone who does evil hates the light, not because light is cruel, but because light reveals what darkness conceals. The crack in the mask is light entering, not explosive, not theatrical, but steady. The more a person fights against that light, the more rigid they become. And rigidity under pressure eventually breaks. What is ending here is not merely a reputation. It is the illusion of invulnerability. They believed they could construct an identity immune to consequence. They believed that if they controlled enough perceptions, they could outrun reality. But reality does not depend on perception. It depends on alignment. When alignment is absent, instability follows. The energy returns to its source. When a person repeatedly introduces confusion into another's life, that confusion does not remain contained. When someone cultivates tension, suspicion, and emotional instability as tools of control, those tools eventually become the atmosphere they must breathe themselves. The narcissist believed they could export chaos without importing consequence. They assumed that what they manufactured for you would remain external, directed, controlled, contained. But the human soul does not operate in compartments. What we practice becomes who we are, and who we are shapes the environments we inhabit. Over time, manipulation ceases to be strategy and becomes instinct. Distrust ceases to be a tactic and becomes reflex. Defensiveness ceases to be occasional and becomes posture, and posture determines climate. This is how energy returns not as mystical retaliation, but as internalization. The instability once directed toward you begins showing up elsewhere. Conversations grow tense more quickly. Patience shortens. Suspicion rises without clear cause. Control attempts increase, because control is the only language they know when equilibrium begins to slip. But control cannot manufacture peace. It can only suppress anxiety temporarily. And when anxiety is suppressed rather than examined, it multiplies beneath the surface. Here lies the deeper consequence. A person who repeatedly distorts truth must constantly monitor that distortion. They must remember which version was told where. They must guard against contradiction. They must preemptively defend against exposure. That vigilance produces restlessness. Restlessness produces fatigue. Fatigue produces cracks. Eventually, the very emotional climate they created for you becomes their default experience. The unease, the unpredictability, The subtle sense that something is unstable beneath the surface. For someone in midlife accustomed to routine, accustomed to established structures, living in quiet instability is profoundly unsettling. There is no dramatic collapse, only erosion. Home feels less restful. Silence feels heavier. Success feels less satisfying, because peace cannot coexist with sustained deception. Scripture speaks plainly, a man reaps what he sows. This is not theatrical punishment, it is moral architecture. If someone sows manipulation, they reap mistrust. If they sow humiliation, they reap isolation. If they sow pride, they reap distance. The soil does not negotiate. It responds. And here is the quiet severity of this ending. They are now living inside the emotional atmosphere they once imposed on you. The second guessing, the tension, the subtle fear that something is slipping, only now there is no one absorbing it for them. When you were present, you absorbed impact. You buffered volatility. You translated their harshness into something tolerable. You softened edges. You carried more than you realized. When you stepped away, the buffer disappeared. What remains with them is what they cultivated. Energy returns to its source, not loudly, but consistently. And consistency is what makes it undeniable. You begin to notice something different on your side. Clarity increases. Your nervous system settles. Sleep deepens. Your thoughts become less tangled. Because the chaos you once carried is no longer yours. It has returned to origin. They played a very dangerous game by believing they could destabilize another soul without destabilizing their own. But reality does not permit that imbalance indefinitely. The real loss and your rise. There is something the narcissist never calculated. They thought losing you was manageable. They assumed they could replace, reframe, rebuild. In their mind you were a piece on the board. What they did not understand is that you were not merely a relationship. You were an opportunity. An opportunity to grow. An opportunity to mature. An opportunity to confront their own ego and choose humility instead. When you entered their life, you brought stability, you brought integrity, you brought a kind of emotional and moral steadiness that many spend decades trying to develop. You were not perfect, but you were anchored, and proximity to someone anchored offers a chance to become anchored. They forfeited that. That is the real loss. Not your presence alone, but the transformation that could have occurred had they chosen differently. Meanwhile, something equally significant has been unfolding in you. You did not just survive manipulation, you gained discernment. You see patterns faster now. You trust your intuition more quickly. You recognize red flags without second-guessing yourself. You no longer confuse intensity with intimacy. You no longer mistake chaos for passion. You no longer equate endurance with virtue. That clarity is not accidental. It was forged. For those walking in faith, this is where perspective shifts. What felt like devastation becomes refinement. What felt like betrayal becomes education. What felt like loss becomes liberation. You have learned that boundaries are not cruelty. That silence can be strength. That surrendering justice to God is not weakness but wisdom. The narcissist played a very dangerous game, believing they could distort truth and walk away unchanged. But games end, and what endures is alignment. You are not rising because they are falling. You are rising because you chose integrity when distortion tempted you. That is the value, not revenge, not spectacle, but clarity. You walk forward lighter, not because the past vanished, but because it no longer defines you. You understand something now that many never learn. Peace is not found in winning against someone. It is found in refusing to become what hurt you, and that is victory of the highest kind. The board has flipped not through force, but through faithfulness. They face their endings. You step into your steadiness, and steadiness, grounded in truth, outlasts every game.